All right, folks. Today we have episode 10 of the Human Performance Outliers Podcast. And today we have a very exciting guest and one I've been really getting amped about having on here. Jeff, aka Bronco Billy Browning, is on the show for us today. How's it going, Jeff?
Good. Great to be on, Zach.
Hey Jeff, it says you're from Bend, Oregon. Is that where you're at right
Uh,
now?
no, I relocated to Logan, Utah about 7 or 8 months ago. So we lived in Bend for 17 years, and we just moved to Utah in September of 2017.
Because isn't Bend kind of a pretty historic place for running? I think. Is there some kind of, I think for some reason I think Bend, Oregon has a lot of
Yeah,
runners from. Am I imagining
it's
that?
a pretty popular endurance sports town. We have one of the longest Nordic seasons in the lower 48, and so a lot of Olympic and really elite Nordic skiers reside in Bend. So we have a really good, it's a good backcountry skiing area, and also good runners as well. Mario Mendoza and Max King and Ian Sharman live there. So, we have a Stephanie Howe Violet, like very very big contingent of runners there. So there was always somebody to train with there. I do miss that a little bit, but I moved to bigger mountains and more vert for mountain running and ultra training, and quieter mountain town that Bend had become kind of crazy.
Yeah, because Oregon in general, I remember because there was that guy Steve Prefontaine from years back. The guy died tragically, and then I think Nike had their headquarters originated out of there and stuff like that. So Oregon's been a kind of a running state, if I'm not mistaken.
It has. It is. Yeah. Eugene's Tracktown, USA. So that's where Free used to race and train, and so there is a deep history of running, especially track and cross country. But a very deep tradition of running in Oregon, and that's kind of where I found ultra running. I had moved there in 2000 and got into ultras in 01.
Hey, where does the nickname Bronco Billy come from? I remember that's like a Clint Eastwood thing. I'm not mistaken. What's that?
I have a really good buddy who I used to train with back in 2002, 2003. He was kind of one of my early ultra mentors, and we used to joke around. I used to yell "giddy up" a lot. I had a buddy that I used to climb with in Denver who yelled that all the time when you were trying to throw for a hard problem, and I used to yell. I got in the habit of using it all the time, and I'd grown up on a farm in Missouri, and he kind of gave me a lot of trouble because I yelled "yeehaw" a lot and "giddy up," and he started calling me Bronco Billy one summer when we were training together a lot, and he was from Norse descent and claimed to be from the Berserker tribe, so I used to call him Berserker, and I used to say things like "Get your battle axe, Berserker," and and so that's kind of how it's. And I started a blog in 04, and more to just give race reports for my family, and back when blogs were nothing and no one had really heard of them, and I got Bronco Billy wasn't available. Well, Jeff Browning wasn't available. Bronco Billy wasn't available, and I come from a graphic design and marketing background, so I grabbed an action word, "Go Bronco Billy," and started using that. And then everyone started just calling me that. Like friends started calling me Bronco, and a lot of running friends from around the U.S. because the ultra running community isn't that big, especially back then in the early days. In the early 2000s, it was such a small cult sport that you saw the same people all the time as you traveled, and just kind of stuck.
So I guess you and Zach are competitors, right? I mean, you guys are running in the same events, same circles and stuff like that. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean we do, but I think we're running against each other in Western states, but our paths don't cross that much. Zach really has over the years has really concentrated on flat, fast stuff, and especially the track stuff where he really excels, and I've really concentrated on really big vert mountain stuff. That's all. I've always been really attracted to wild, hard courses, and so I'm a 100-mile runner, so that's my best distance. So I've always focused on hundreds, and yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to think of that. I don't think we've actually raced. I know you were at Ice Age one year when I was, but I think you might have done the 50K and I was in the 50 mile.
Oh, I've only been there once and did the 50 miler, and you were not there.
Oh, okay, so I must have that wrong then. But yeah, so I guess Western States will be the first time we toe the line trying to beat each other. But
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be
Better bring your A game, Zach.
That's what I was going to say. I'm wondering if we ask you some of your training secrets, if you're going to give us a real deal or not, because
I don't mind giving my training secrets. Western States is hard, man. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, speaking of Western States too, I think one of the compelling stories to talk about today would be like your history with that event, and I think it's a very interesting one because you were kind of more or less late to the game to do that one, but you've done it the last 2 years and done quite well with a third place finish in 2016 and a fourth place finish last year, which when you're looking at pretty much unarguably the most competitive 100-miler in North America, and probably either second or first in the world, depending on how the UTMB field plays out. That's a pretty astonishing accomplishment.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I have a long history of that race. It was my first 100 in 2002, and I couldn't get back into it for years and years. Thanks to Ultra Footwear, got me back in.
Oh, okay.
In 2016, I still couldn't. I tried to race in, but as you know, Zach, I mean, ultra distances are very unique, and the 100-miler is a very unique distance compared to, say, a 50-miler or 100K even. And someone who's really good at a 100-miler can be okay at a 50-miler or a 100K, but it's really hard, with a lot of these younger fast guys coming up in the last 5 or 6 years. For me to go race a 50-mile or 100K, I'm lucky if I'm in the top 7, or sometimes, I might be in the top 3, but for me, it was really hard to race in a 50 mile or 100K race, in the golden ticket races. And I tried maybe 3 or 4 times and just couldn't, I was like, 4th and 6th and stuff like that in those races. And, but you let me I just knew I needed to get to the start line. If I could get on the start line, I could stay in the top 10, and because that's my distance.
Right, and then for listeners who don't know, if you finish in the top 10 at Western States, you get an automatic invite the next year, so you don't have to race your way in or try to get in through the lottery. And it's a fascinating event in that, like, the lottery is almost equally as hard to get in through. Where your first go around, if you just apply like for the first time, you have like less than a 3% chance of getting accepted. And part of that's just because of the regulations on the trails of how many people, like the permits, how many people have out there. They have to keep the field under 400, and thousands of people apply. So it makes it kind of a tough one to get into for anybody. And then it is interesting because like all the golden ticket races now are 100K and then 150-miler, I believe. So it really does make it a lot harder for the 100-mile specialists to race their way in. But then like guys like you and Ian Sharman have shown, like once you get in, it's like if you guys have a decent day, you're probably going to crack the top 10. And then if you really nail one, you might get on the podium like you did in 2016.
Yeah, exactly. And that's it. It's definitely, I like that they have the golden ticket races. I do wish they had a couple of 100-mile golden ticket races just to let those guys who, older guys especially, people like me and Carl Meltzer, for us to be able to race in, we need a 100-miler.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah.
Do you mind sharing with the listeners how old you are, Jeff?
No, 46, almost 47.
So folks, that's one of the reasons I asked him that is because one thing I said on a previous episode is that when I'm looking at kind of like a high fat diet versus a high carbohydrate diet, the thing that just kind of keeps coming back is these people like Dr. Shawn Baker here, and then Jeff Browning as well, where they almost seemingly are able to reverse age when they kind of bring in that type of a nutritional protocol. And Jeff was 45 and 46 when he finished 3rd and 4th at Western States, and that wasn't even the end of it. In 2016, when you finished 3rd at Western States, you also doubled down and went to probably the most difficult 100-miler in the U.S. in terms of just technicality, steepness, potential weather, and finished 3rd there as well. And that was 3 weeks after?
I came back, and actually I finished 4th at Hard Rock. So I came back 19 days later and ran Hard Rock 100. Didn't quite get on the podium. Was chasing Xavier from France in 3rd all night. Never could reel him in. I think I got within maybe 30 or 35 minutes of him in the middle of the night, and then he did a surge at the end, and I think we were about close to about an hour apart at the end. But that's so hard rock. Everybody's spread out.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a hard course. It isn't like Western States where you turn around and like, if you tie your shoe, 3 guys pass you.
Right.
But at Hard Rock, a lot of times you're hour or even 3 hours apart. So once it kind of settles in later in the race, second half of the race. But yeah, it's a hard race. The Hard Rock's, average elevation 11,100 feet. I think you go over 13,000 feet 7 times. Climb a 14er during the race, and I have to say, I gotta take the time to give you a shout out, Zach, because you were really instrumental in helping me get fat adapted at the beginning and move to this diet and kind of, bypass a few like road bumps that come with the learning curve of this, especially with regards to endurance training. And because you're the first person I reached out to, because we had talked, I think, to give everybody, listeners, a little background. I'd been a high carb athlete for 15 years, racing and training and running ultras, and I've been running ultras since 2001. And I had 2200s as a high carb athlete under my belt, and probably close to 100 ultras, and or at the time maybe 890 ultras. And back in the end of 2015, I was having some health issues. And 2 years before that at Outdoor Retailer, Zach and I had kind of connected, and we had chatted about diet. And I don't even know if he remembers that, but we had done some chatting about diet. And I had thought about going like kind of a paleo diet, and my wife and I had. And my wife has maybe a little bit of what I'd call insulin resistance or hypoglycemia a little bit. We found over the years that days where she'd double down on simple carbs, she'd get like a migraine and stuff like that. So over the years, as we kind of evolved from like a vegetarian diet to a whole foods diet with clean meats and grass-fed wild mimic meats, but we're still doing a bunch of grains, more of a nourishing traditions. If anybody's familiar with that diet, nourishing traditions type of diet. That's what I was doing when I met Zach, and maybe back in like probably I'd say that'd be back 2013 when we talked. Zach, I don't know. You hadn't been doing it that long at the time. I can't remember when you shifted.
Yeah. I kind of dove in at the end of 2011. So then in 2013, when
you would have been like 2 years in, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of got some momentum, I think, when I did Desert Solstice in 2013, because then it was like that was probably the first race that really like put me on the radar more or less in North America as an ultra runner. And then people always want to know, like, well, what were you doing? And then when I said I follow a high-fat approach, that was pretty, it's a little more, I think people don't necessarily turn their head twice as quickly anymore, but back then they certainly did. But,
yeah, then it was just you and Timmy, I think, were the only ones that were kind of toying around with, and Mike Morton.
Yeah.
Were kind of toying around with that diet at the time, and with regards to endurance training, and there wasn't that much talk about it then.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No.
Hey, Jeff. I just a couple comments. I was listening. I was reading about the difference between like a marathon runner physiology and an ultra guy's physiology. And, we see that the marathon runners tend to they run a little bit higher heart rate throughout the race, and you guys are a little slightly lower heart rate, which makes sense because you're going for so much longer. And then one thing they point out is many of the ultra guys are over 40, and it's kind of like you see a bigger spread of guys that are competing over 40. Did you find that because you said you did lots and lots of 100-mile races as you've gone on, have you found that you're actually even hitting your best numbers now after the age of 40, and then coupling in this sort of new higher fat approach to your diet?
Yeah, I think that was kind of my point I was getting at, and I was kind of getting at it as beating around the bush there, because we went back to the history of how Zach and I met. But I feel like there's a couple of things that at play here. One is experience, and you can't ever discount time, training, and consistency, right? All the years of ultra training. I've been doing it. This is my 18th season of training and racing ultras. And so there is that factor, right? But I would say that my performance has definitely been its best in my 40s, but also it went up a notch when I shifted my diet. I feel like that was a pretty big performance enhancer for me. I lost 8 pounds as an elite athlete. When you're when you can lose 8 pounds, your strength to weight ratio and your VO2 max both go way up from that point. So, at least you get a bump in numbers just by losing weight. And before, on a high carb approach, I just could not. I had trouble getting down to race weight the older I got. It was easier when I was younger, in my 30s, but when I got into my 40s, I found that, like, there's that old saying that your metabolism slows down after 35, and I really felt that in my early 40s, and I really felt that, like, recovery wasn't quite as good, and I was really had a lot of inflammation after racing hundreds and big training blocks. And my wife, my wife says, I mentioned to her, I don't even remember saying this, but I told her, I'm like, I think I'm about done racing, a few years ago, maybe like 2014, 2015. I'm like, I don't know how many more years I can do this. Cause at the time I was doing like 400s a year. And I just was beat up after races and cloudy in my mind and really inflamed in my knees and my ankles. And, and then I, after a race in South America, I came back and had like a kind of like some health issues. I had a candida overgrowth in my GI tract, and I had some really bad rashes break out and like all kinds of stuff. And I was just I had like 7 outbreaks in 2015. And that's when I got desperate. This is the 7th outbreak. I started doing I spent a week just online every night, 8 to midnight, every night, probably 20, 25 hours worth of research in 1 week. And I knew enough about diet. I'd studied so much diet over the years. My wife and I, as we'd kind of tinkered and evolved our eating lifestyle, we really just, I came across, hey, yeast feeds on sugar, and you're going to have to, I was looking at it in diet forums, and I came across a bunch of paleo primal blueprint type and high fat, low carb forums, and it said, quit feeding the yeast, And so I said, I told my wife, I think I'm gonna have to kind of go like a paleo style of eating and really cut out grains and sugar and everything else. And she goes, well, I got 3 cookbooks. And so she whips out 3 paleo cookbooks. We shifted that night. And we never looked back. And maybe after about 4 or 5 days into it, I had been digging into some of this stuff that was starting to come out about fat adaptation and the faster study that Zach was a part of. And that's when I really started to say, wait, there's a performance thing here. I'd come across BestPower.com's website, and there's a bunch of information on OFM, optimized fat metabolism, and how it kind of plays into endurance training and how it can help. And that really made sense to me. I was almost a nutrition major in college, but became a designer and graphic designer instead. And so I'd always had this hobby on the side of like being really into nutrition and reading and like kind of consuming a lot of content. So I had a lot of knowledge, but that really, when I started digging into that, I was like, wow, I never read any of that stuff. And it just really made sense. Made sense from our seasonal eating patterns as our background was hunter-gatherers and hunter-herders, and in growing up on a farm and seeing a commercial farm and understanding, how dirty it is, and how bad it is for the environment. It all made sense to me. It just added up. And then once I started doing it, I called Zach and I just said, how do I do this with running? And he kind of gave me some tips, and I just kind of, I think I had 7 weeks from when I shifted. I had 7 weeks till I had a 100-miler. I was in the middle of training for a winter 100 in Hawaii and Hurt 100, and that 7 weeks I went on a crash course keto, and then I kind of shifted to use strategic carbohydrates around effort and volume, and it just all the pop came back, and I went to that race and nailed it in 2000. That was the beginning of 2016. And I had a huge year in 2016. I mean, it was, 3rd at Western States and the double record, 4th at Hard Rock, got a course record and won 100K in Kansas, kind of on my home turf near where I grew up. And then I think I had another win at the end of the year in a 50K. And that was just a great year. And it was really that one of those years where I was just like, whoa. Like it was kind of one of those big aha moments in life when you go, you know what? There's something to this and it works and I feel great and my inflammatory response is like incredibly low. And that's the biggest thing I think as a masters athlete, especially post like late 40s athlete. That's a big one is recovery. And as you know, everyone always talks, oh, you know, masters runners need to, you know, do more cross training because, you know, they just can't handle the volume anymore because of, you know, recovery. But I felt like I was 10 years younger just by shifting my diet. That was huge.
That's a similar thing that I've noticed, and that's the same thing I noticed. You know, I think it's not so much overtraining; it's under recovering, and I find that my recovery on a high fat, or in my case, you know, a high fat carnivorous diet has been outstanding. And I've noticed the very same things. I think, you know, the more you can train without being beat up and inflamed and sore and stiff, the better your performance is going to be ultimately. I think it's you have to look at the whole picture. I know Tim Noakes is big about this. You know, we do these studies and they look at just one variable, you know, around these you know, these little short 3-week cycling studies where they test ketogenic athletes. But as you guys know, and I know, doing this day in and day out, month after month after month, when your recovery is better, when you're not beat up, when you're not taking all those hits, your training is just better over a period of time. And in the long run, that adds up to improved performance in my view.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And one thing that these studies are so short that I think one thing that Dr. Volek has really pointed out is like, hey, if you're going to do this, like it really takes 8 to 12 weeks for you to of restricting carbohydrate to really start to get efficient and really see it. And I felt like the longer, I mean, I've been doing it 2.5 years now and racing and training hard. And I feel like I've gotten more and more efficient even after a year on it.
Yeah.
You know, so I think the longer you stay consistent, the more benefit you get from this.
Yeah, that's you know, that's one thing that I try to share with people too, is like I noticed some immediate advantages like you did, just like kind of leaning out a little bit and sleeping through the night, getting rid of some of that like swelling in the ankles and the legs and things like that. Those were like things I kind of cleared up within the first couple of weeks. But then it was like a year and a half, 2 years in before I remember hitting a training block at the end of 2000 or probably midway to the back 2/3 of 2013, which would have been just shy of 2 years since I had kind of started, and thinking like, wow, this is like a whole nother level. And so yeah, a lot of times I think people, they don't give it enough time to kind of take in to set in. And I also think the longer you do it too, you can kind of you almost reset your system to the point where you can get away with more carbohydrates without bumping you out of ketosis. Like I've been kind of playing around with this a little bit. I usually don't check that stuff because I really don't care if I'm in ketosis or not. I more or less like want to know if I'm fat adapted enough to go for a really long run without needing to fuel. But I get asked enough that I started kind of checking the last couple of weeks, and you know, I had a day that I was convinced would put me out of ketosis and would maybe take me another day to get back in, where I had like, I think it totaled like 4 cups of cantaloupe, 2 cups of blueberries, a tablespoon of raw honey, and a medium to large sweet potato. And then the next morning I was back in ketosis. So like, I mean, I think you can.
Yeah,
switch.
I agree. I've had the same experience. I use a breathalyzer to check, and so I'm having the same thing. I can take in hard training blocks. I can take my carbs pretty high. You know, 100 to 200 grams a day, depending on the volume block. And I barely get, if I get knocked out, I only get knocked out to like a low carb zone, meaning I'm still producing ketones. I'm just not officially in nutritional ketosis, but I'll be back in within less than 24 hours. It just barely kicks me out, especially on the days when I do simple carbs on a long run. If I'm doing like a 4.5, 5 hour run and, you know, I'm sipping 100 calories an hour or something from like a powdered carbohydrate drink. You know, I use GU Roctane, and if I'm sipping some Roctane, it'll knock me out a little. But I've even found there's sometimes that doesn't even knock me out.
Right. Yeah. I tested again like that next day. I did a really big workout after, you know, checking the reason I had brought those carbs back in the first place, because I had a big workout scheduled, and I got back from that run, and I even had, I think, another sweet potato after that workout, and within a couple hours I do you use the ketonics meter?
I use one called the Keto Meter,
Okay.
which is, it's just a, it's a little less expensive version of it that actually one of my athletes I coach makes them.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, ketometer.biz. I'll give him a little plug.
Cool. Yeah, check that out, folks.
Yeah.
Hey,
Anyway.
let me ask a quick question for both you guys, because on these ultra races, they're usually, they're like with a marathon, they have check stations, every mile or two. They're loaded up with people, they're stocked up with stuff. How does it work in an ultra? Do you have to carry your own fuel with you, and how do you fuel during those 100-mile races? Because obviously, I assume most of you guys are doing some sort of either electrolyte replacement or some kind of nutrition replacement. So do you carry it with you, or how does that, how do you, what's the strategy for that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely, every race is a little different because it depends on the course. Like these mountain courses it's wherever they can get, a truck or some kind of vehicle into the backcountry, usually, or sometimes they have to pack stuff in with horses. It just depends. Some are backpacked in if they're really backcountry in some races. So they'll be more minimal, but bare minimum, most of these aid stations are, usually 5 to 10 miles apart, depending on the course and how wild it is. They definitely, bare minimum, they're going to have a little bit of food and some water in these, like if someone had to backpack in. But if most of them are going to have, quite a smorgasbord of food, everything from candy and sweets and cookies to chips and potatoes and fruit. Water, and usually some kind of electrolyte replacement drink option, whatever's a sponsor of that race, type of deal. And then we carry our own thing. So usually you're carrying about 20 to 60 ounces of water, depending on the course and how hard it is and how long it is between stations. And then you're carrying a little bit of food. So usually, simple stuff like carbohydrate drink or gels or something like that in between the aid stations, and a little bit of solid foods at the aid station.
Do you have a specific strategy? Like, like plan ahead, I'm going to eat here and I'm going to eat this much, or is it just you kind of go as how you're feeling?
I'm very simple and stick to my own plan. Most of what I take in is my own calories. I don't really use much of the aid stations except for a little fruit. And maybe a little broth if it's a 100-miler at night, if they have some salty broth of some sort. But most of the time for me, it's I'm IV dripping goo Roctane. It's like powdered carbohydrate drink in between aid stations, about 100 calories between every aid station. So that comes out to about 100 calories an hour from that. And then I eat a little bit of solid food at the top of every hour. So I carry some salted plantain chips in a Ziploc bag. I'll have a few chips at the top of every hour, or if an aid station shows up around that time, I'll have fruit instead. Not very much. I don't eat very much. I probably put down about 150 to 200 calories an hour during 100.
Yeah, and just to kind of fill people in too who aren't like 100-mile runners or aren't into ultra marathons, that like one of the biggest variables that becomes more pronounced in a 100-mile race or anything over that, or when you're going to be out there for like 12, 14, 16, 20 plus hours, is this ability to kind of continue to eat. And I think Jeff would agree with me where like when you're looking at that variable, the more you can minimize it, the better. Like the less you have to rely on food, the better. Like you have this like I guess a gas tank of body fat, and even the leanest athletes out there have enough there to get them through a long race. So if you can tap into that and avoid having to like try to hit maybe 400 calories an hour, which I think is fairly typical for some of these top runners, it's a game changer when you can lower that to those levels that Jeff just described. It becomes a lot less of a tedious variable. And then on races like Western States, where you might see 100 to even 110 degrees in the canyon sections, when you're going up and down hills over switchbacks and it gets that hot, like that just makes it even that much harder to digest anything. So like, yeah,
that's a really good point, Zach, because that's a big one at Western States, especially this diet, and being able to tap in your own fat at a high level, really is a game changer when it comes to GI stress. And I think that's one of the bigger benefits, besides the recovery, that's one of the bigger benefits I feel like, because you're burning your own fat stores, you don't have to worry about taking as many calories per hour. One, that makes it really convenient because you don't have to carry as much. Second is you really just don't have the GI stress because, I mean, as a high carb athlete, like I mentioned earlier, for 15 years, I was down in 300 to 500 calories an hour. And I always had a little garbage gut at mile 75 or 80 of a 100-miler. A little GI stress, like where it just kind of sitting in your gut like a rock. I mean, I always consider myself to have an iron gut, but because I never really, only a handful of times did I throw up in 2200s. I've done 30 now, but the last 7 or 8, I guess, on kind of the high fat approach. But I definitely don't have any GI stress during. The only time I've had GI stress, I have to say, during this high fat approach, is when I've gone to an aid station late in the race and broken a rule of keeping it simple and eaten a bunch of food. Where it's just like, that, because you feel so good and your stomach's not upset, and you come into like Hard Rock in 2016, I had a little GI stress after mile 75. I came into Sherman and they had bacon, and there was a lot of bacon, and I ate a lot of bacon. I probably ate like 4 pieces, and in 100, as 4 pieces is a lot. That's a lot of complex fat and protein to throw at your gut. And so like, I didn't throw up or anything, but my stomach was a little off after that. And I was like, that was like a good learning experience. It was like, I'd done so well on it in 2016 up until that point that I just kind of broke a rule and said, hey, I just chowed down some bacon, and then you're pushing really hard at altitude, and then all of a sudden, it's like you go up to 12,000, and I was above 11,000 feet from that point forward, and it was just like, it just didn't digest.
Yeah. Then that brings up another question I was going to ask you about too, Jeff, was, when you kind of like dive into the world of keto and keto athletes, a lot of times I think people assume that, guys like you and myself are eating fat during the race. And, it would make sense when you look at kind of our macronutrient breakdown from our day-to-day lives. But what I've always told people is like, eating fat during a race seems at least somewhat counterintuitive unless it's a really long race, like maybe 24 hours or further, because like, you're getting fat calories, sure, but you're making your body digest them as opposed to bypassing the digestive tract altogether. And then, if you're going to do fueling, which I think pretty much everyone does to some degree, us obviously a lot less, but you're going to refuel that gas tank that's going to deplete a lot more readily, like the glycogen stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I run into this a lot coaching athletes because I coach a bunch of my coached athletes are kind of doing OFM, and so they're eating their everyday lifestyle, this high fat approach, to get this optimized fat metabolism going and really burn onboard fat. And I think that's where there's some, I don't know, misinformation in the ultra running community, at least endurance community, is that, hey, we stay keto all the time. Or, I hear a lot of people say, are you a keto athlete? A keto athlete? Keto. And I would say, no, I use keto as a tool. I used it to adapt. And then I use it occasionally for maybe 7 to 14 days to reset every once in a while. Or if I need to drop a couple pounds, I might go back to a pretty low carb approach, like where I'm at 50 grams. But most of the time I'm eating kind of more of a paleo primal blueprint style of eating, where I'm at 75 to 150 grams of carbs a day when I'm training. I might go keto on a day when I'm taking a rest day, when I take my carbs lower. So I'm mirroring that with that intake with volume and effort. And also, you don't eat fat during the race. So I stick to simple carbohydrates, stuff that breaks down really easily in the gut. Because here's the thing, and this is, I think, where the misinformation is. You're not burning exogenous fat, right? Fat you're intaking. Because that's, like you said, it's a very complex process for the body to break that fat down, and protein too. But it's quicker at breaking down glucose and breaking down carbohydrate. And that's why we use carbohydrate. We're really, the reason we're doing this in our everyday life is to tap into our fat stores. And that's the key, and why this is such a good approach for endurance sports, especially for long races like ultra marathons, is because that fuel source is so much more efficient. And to give reader or the listeners, I mean, a little bit of like a quick understanding of why is when you, on average, for every unit of oxygen you consume, if you're burning glucose as your primary fuel, so for all those high carb athletes out there, your primary fuel source is glucose. If you're burning glucose, for every unit of oxygen you consume, you're kicking out an equal unit of CO2. Okay, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So one unit of oxygen for a unit of waste, basically, right? But if you're burning onboard fat, we're not talking exogenous fat, and that's where the confusion lies, I think, in what we're doing. We're talking about onboard fat. We've adapted so our metabolic system can start tapping into a high rate of onboard fat per minute for fuel. Then that 1 unit of oxygen on average to 0.75 CO2. So it's more efficient fuel source, meaning you are kicking out less waste for every unit of oxygen you're consuming if you can tap into your onboard fat. That's the key to this. You do less oxidative stress. And I think that's what we see over the course of a 100-miler, and what I saw between being a 2200s as a high carb athlete and then the last 8, I used to have to wear compression after every 100 for like 3 days. I had to sleep in it. I had like cankles. You couldn't see my ankle bones. I looked like I rolled my ankle. You know, when your ankles balloons up. That's what both my ankles looked like after 100 milers, every 100 miler for 2,200 milers. And then every single 100 since then, I don't wear compression unless I'm flying. I don't wear compression. I throw on my flip-flops. I walk around and I'm not swollen. I'm micro-swole. I have some micro-swelling the first, 48 hours, but I don't have the throbbing big swelling. And I think that's the key here is we do less oxidative stress because we have a very clean fuel source because it's on board.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, and Zach mentioned that a similar thing happened to him on the races with the swelling. I think Owen Franks through the New Zealand All Black, he had a similar type story about all the swelling. And one of the things, with oxidative stress, you're doing damage. That's damaging to various metabolic machinery and tissues. And then you get this compensatory inflammation that follows that. And the inflammation is an attempt to try to, take care of that. That's our body's acute response to that. But what you're showing is you're just not taking as much damage. And I think what we're seeing is one of the reasons these guys that, can be, in the older age categories like myself, Jeff, and some of the other guys I've talked to, see that, they're able to perform better at a longer period of time just because they're not getting beat up as much or not getting damaged as much. And I think that more than anything is a huge benefit for, that during that nutritional strategy. I think a lot of people were seeing that, many athletes are, performing actually fairly well. I mean, they're toughing it out, but they're taking all this oxidative stress and all this damage. And then it shows up with things like injuries or, shortened careers, which I think is, a different way to look at things.
Well, another one too, I experienced after post hundreds on a high carb approach is that I had really had brain haze for a week after hundreds. With all that external inflammation, I had to be getting some kind of inflammation in the brain too, because I literally was like, I felt like I was like kind of out of it, for a week or so, at least 4 or 5 days after 100. And I always chalked it up to just these things, you didn't sleep for a night and you missed a night of sleep and you're just tired. But the thing is after I switched to a high fat approach, I didn't get that cloudiness anymore.
Yeah, I remember, Jeff, when you did the Hurt 100, which would have been that like 7 or 8 week period when you had done the kind of the crash course, like super low carb, just to try to fix the candida. And I remember you messaged me after that, and you're like, I couldn't believe it. The next day I was doing air squats, my legs felt there was obviously you were a little sore from the race and stuff, but there wasn't that that swelling that would almost make it impossible to bend your knees and move your joints and stuff around.
Well, that's one thing I noticed too, that was huge. Like everyone always, over the years had always asked, like, oh, what's it like, that right after you get done with a 100-miler? Like I said, well, your body kind of seizes up. You're done running and your legs seize up and you can barely walk. You have to help yourself into the seat of a car, and you can't walk downstairs very well. And, and I said, that lasts for about 12 to 14 hours. And then it kind of loosens up and it goes into the shock for the first 12 to 14 hours, and then it loosens up. I found with this approach, that first 12 to 14 hour phase goes away. It doesn't happen. So I just go right to phase 2 of the old way. And that's where everything's kind of loose. I can go downstairs, but I can't pop down them, but I can sit down into a seat. I can sit on the toilet without putting my arms on the toilet seat to let myself down onto the seat, or whatever. I know that's kind of disgusting, but that's kind of what you have to deal with after a 100-miler. You're so sore and inflamed. And I chalk that up as just normal damage because hundreds are long. But I realized that afterwards from the shift that, actually that was my diet was causing that.
Yeah, and it's always kind of interesting to me because you'll hear like almost every like kind of counter or excuse after you've been doing it long enough, and I know like sometimes I'll even get accused of it being a placebo effect in my mind, and like there's definitely I agree that the placebo effect can be a very powerful thing, and it can influence how things work or how you process things in your mind. But like when you have scenarios like what you've described, and then like I remember like when you asked me before if I had remember talking about that at OR, I remember that conversation, and I also remember thinking like when I saw a picture of you at Hurt, like a race picture, seeing you like you obviously were a very fit person before that, but you noticeably got leaner. Like you were
completely, dude.
Whole nother level.
I had to go buy all new jeans. I mean, I went down 2 waist sizes. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're talking like I'm trained. My training volume. I've been tracking my training volume since 2000s, and paper log and now a digital log. But like it. So my training volume over the last say 5 or 6 years hasn't changed much. Like it's pretty close to the same. But you look at the pictures before and after. I put together some before and after pictures. It's pretty impressive. Like I'm totally different looking. Like my body, my arms, my shoulders, like my legs, my stomach, like everything. My wife was like, oh my gosh. Like she always used to like joke around how I had a big butt. And I always chalked it up to being like that was like hereditary in my family, and that it went from all the years of cycling. But I mean, as soon as I went on this diet, and changed my lifestyle to getting rid of grains and sugar, it really, I mean, I don't have a butt anymore.
Yeah,
and I lost a lot of weight, and it was all mainly my core. It was like from the bottom of my chest to the upper half of my quads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I always kind of think about when I see like a high caliber athlete, or just even someone who's competing in the top 10 at like ultra marathons and stuff like that, is like you see it a lot where you get these guys in their 20s and 30s, and they're pretty robust, so you can throw a lot at them, and they're lean, visible abs and all that stuff. And then if you have someone who was like that, and then they're continuing to try to stay competitive into their 40s, and they're still training the same way, but now the difference is they've got this like nice little layer of fat over some of their like like their core section or their upper legs and things like that. That's a sign that it's a nutritional issue, not like a training issue. It's it's what you were able to get away with earlier, you're no longer to get away with. And I think that's at least partly why sometimes we see people gravitate towards this kind of later on, because they can no longer really like make the mistakes they were when they were younger, and if they want to stay lean and fit and at that competitive spot, then they have to start addressing nutrition a lot closer.
Absolutely. I see that all the time with my coached athletes. A lot of the people I coach are late 30s to early 50s, and so 40s is kind of like the average. And they really in that age bracket, 35 to 50, is where we see people who've been doing some kind of athletic endeavor for a long time. where they feel like, I just can't quite get to my race weight anymore. That's what I experienced. I just can't quite get there. I mean, I get within a couple pounds, but I just couldn't quite get there. It was really hard. I would have had to like starve myself, you know? And with this, it makes it easy. Like, after some time off, after 100 or after an off season, and I put on like this year I put on 4 pounds. All I did was a 14-day keto reset, dude, right back down to 138, right back down to race weight at the beginning of the spring, and I've been there ever since. So
Hey Jeff, let me interrupt here. Because you said you didn't change your training any. What do you think about the caloric intake during those periods where you're dropping? Are you tracking calories? Is it a significant caloric reduction, or is it just the type of food that's attributing to the fat loss? What do you think?
I think it's a deeper fat burning, because when I'm going into those 14-day resets or something, or a 2-week reset, I'm going back keto, like where I'm going really low carb. So like I'm only having carbs like veggies at lunch and dinner, and maybe a handful of berries as a snack before bedtime, and that's it. So I'm maybe hitting 50, 60 grams of carbs a day, but I'm training at the same time. So
are you dramatically dropping your caloric intake, or do you even calculate that?
No, I don't really calculate that. I did when I first started doing this, but now I go into, it's more intuitive, and I just make sure I have a lot of. I mean, I cook with fat. I have fat in my coffee. I have fat with pretty much every meal and every snack. I have some kind of fat. So I mean, even those handful of berries, that's like what I call a fat parfait, and it'd be a heaping spoonful of coconut oil, a spoonful of almond butter, mix it together with a little stevia, sprinkle some berries on it, pour some heavy whipping cream or some coconut milk over the top, and eat it as like a parfait. So it's not a lot of carbs in it, but it's a lot of fat. So I have a decent amount of calories coming in, but I don't have a ton of carb calories coming in. And I do carb fast pretty much every day. 95% of my week or a day that I don't have carbs until after. I work out at lunch during the week, so I don't have carbs until after lunch. I mean, at lunch. I mean, after my workout. So like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So most of my carbs are eaten in a 6 to 9 hour window. So that means I'm carb fasting, 14 to 18 hours a day, most days, meaning the last carb I had was probably 9 o'clock at night, and the first carb I'm going to have is 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the next day after a workout. So I'll have fat and protein in the mornings, but I'll only have fat and protein.
Yeah,
but no carbs.
I think the interesting thing you said there, Jeff, was that with the approach you're following, you are in a position where if you eat intuitively, your body's going to find where it needs to be based on the activities you're doing. So you're asking a lot of your body, and you're asking your body to move long distances. So it's going to find that point where that power weight ratio is at an optimal spot for you, and you don't have to think about you don't really have to think a whole lot about well, I better not have that that extra snack because I need to shed a pound, or you just listen to your body, and if you're hungry you eat, and if you're not you don't, and then everything kind of normalizes. Whereas you see these roller coasters that people go on, especially not probably as much elite athletes, but just general people who are trying to get in shape for a race, or trying to get healthy. It's like if they find themselves in this position where they're hungry, but they're like, I better not eat anything because I still need to lose that last 5 pounds, and then you can't eat intuitively. So
right,
I think a lot.
That's
of times,
a great thing about this. You don't have to think. I just eat to satiety, and there's times when I definitely eat a serious amount of calories in one setting. Like after a long run, I'll eat multiple servings of fruit throughout the day after that long run. And then I find I snack like crazy. I'm just kind of hungry, so I just listen. Well, And the other thing I found that is if you kind of gravitate more towards a high fat protein during those times when you're really craving versus a bunch of fruit, it'll satiate you faster. So instead of otherwise you'll just keep wanting to eat. You know what I mean? So I found that going towards really good sources of stuff, like a good ribeye or a T-bone, a good grass-fed, grass-finished T-bone or something like that after a big long run, that with a good solid, vegetables cooked in some fat, and then maybe a potato or something, or sweet potato smothered in butter, and then you'll be really satiated. But if I eat kind of like a lighter meal after a big effort, I'm thinking back to Friday. I did a almost 24-mile run with 6,000 feet of climbing, and I went on really low calories that day. Like I did it late in the afternoon, and I ate a pretty light day of food. So I don't think I'd had very many carbs either. So I went into it pretty carb fasted, and I went really low on my calories per hour. So like, maybe 90 or 100 calories per hour during that run. And so when I got home, I was like hungry, and I was like, I'm going to eat. And I ate a meal, and then I ate another meal, and then I snacked like a bunch that night. And I think I went to bed with, my stomach like it's all stuck out because I'd eaten so many calories in like, the 5 hours after the run until I went to bed.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the one thing I'll notice, like, to kind of go back to with the intuitive eating side of things, is that like when you can get away with doing that, like on this approach, because like you have access to your fat stores. So if you're out and you don't want to be bothered with all the logistics of bringing a bunch of food along and things like that, you go out for that long run, you come back. And for me, it's like if I do something like that, I have that same situation you do but I can trust it. So it's like I'll eat like my normal size meal, and then like I'll be like, oh, I'm still hungry. I'll keep eating, and like it's noticeable. Like your body almost just kind of like re-alters its expectations based on the workload you put on it. So then once you're kind of where you want to be, you can just trust your hunger pangs, and you can trust when you're full and when you're hungry and all that stuff. It makes it just a lot less of a hassle.
I agree. And the other thing I would say on this, that I think one thing that as endurance athletes especially, that we can up our protein sources more. Like a lot of keto eating says moderate protein, moderate protein, moderate protein. I do think we can go up our protein, especially if we're going for fattier cuts of wild mimic meats and variety, that you can up your ratio. If you're going to look at macros, you can up your ratio of protein on this when you're in training blocks, because you are breaking down muscle, you need to repair. I do find that, fatty cuts are one, I tend not to overeat as much either, like where you kind of the old school, like I can't quit eating type of scenario. On the high carb, as a high carb athlete, there'd be times where you just eat, and then you'd have to undo your belt buckle. That's kind of, I don't really get that on this. I'm just kind of satisfied, especially if I go for the good sources of stuff, especially good sources of fatty proteins.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, clearly, I mean, there's quite a bit of evidence that shows that endurance athletes in particular need more protein than your average person, for sure. And I think as we get older, we need more protein. Aside from the stuff that I do, where I just eat a bunch of, a carnivorous diet where I get plenty of protein and also plenty of fat. I mean, my diet is probably by calorie something like 70% fat, and so I'm still kind of hitting close to those ketogenic macro ratios, and I think that's important for that. Let me just kind of change gears a little bit, and a question for both you guys a little bit, because you talked about the tedium of some of what you do, because it is, you're running for 100 miles is, there's a lot of stuff going on where you're just kind of doing the same thing. How do you dissociate, or do you dissociate? Sometimes you find like I was a cross country runner in high school, believe it or not. I don't think I ran more than about half a marathon, but I just found that there was times where you just kind of get into it, and where your mind just kind of dissociates itself from your body, and so your mind is kind of off here thinking about something else, and you don't even notice your body. Do you find that it's almost like an out of body, meditative experience as you get into a flow, or are you too engaged with the other athletes to have that happen when you're in the races?
Do you want to answer that first, Zach, or you want me to?
Go ahead.
For me personally, I train a lot alone. I have a wife and 3 kids and a couple of businesses, and so it's hard for me to hook up with other people. Maybe once a week I get on a group run, and that's it. So for me, I like being in the woods by myself. And so the races, you end up kind of being, even when you're racing around a bunch of people, you don't end up really chatting that much. Maybe in the first 30, 40 miles of 100, you might chat a little bit, but after that, you're kind of in your own zone. And I kind of feel like you find a flow state where you just kind of, it's meditative more. your mind kind of goes in and out of like, you're thinking about everything and sometimes nothing, or sometimes just thinking about, just counting your steps, or I don't know. For me, if I'm racing, sometimes it's like I'm gonna run for 19 steps, and then I'm gonna hike for 7, and or whatever. So like I think there's a lot of different places your mind goes during a 100-miler and during those long efforts of sometimes 15, 18, 20 hours or more. Yeah, it's all over the place, but it's definitely meditative for sure.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I know it's meditative is because when I get asked what I was thinking about during it, I can never remember. So it's like, well, yeah, what was I thinking about? And you're thinking of something during that full day of running. But yeah, I think kind of like along the lines that Jeff said, I think you kind of go in and out of it a little bit. I think like there's sections where you kind of get in a groove and it's just like everything seems to be humming and you just ride it. And then there's times where like things get a little more tough mentally and physically, and then you try to break things down to be real simple. Like, all right, I'm going to do like 20 strides and then 10 power hikes, and just try to like, rather than trying to think about this entire task you're trying to accomplish, try to think of like the most immediate thing to try to take your mind off some of the stuff coming up ahead that will potentially kind of put you into a frenzy.
Yeah, definitely ebbs and flows.
What do you guys do, Jeff? What do you do, like, just for motivation? I mean, because obviously there's got to be some kind of psychological thing going on that gets you up every day, out on the trails or out on the track or whatever, wherever you're doing your training. I mean, is there something that you do mentally to say, I'm gonna, how do I prepare for the Western States or whatever big event's going on? Do you have like, and I talked to Zach and I talked about Owen about this, and do you create some sort of I almost call it an enemy, but do you have like a person you focus on? I'm going to beat that person, or is it just internal? I'm going to beat myself. What is the psychology that for me, I know I like to externalize stuff. I always paint the other guy as a bad guy, and there's no way he can beat me, and I'm just going to push myself faster, harder than that guy. Or is it just I'm going to see how far I can go, and that's where it stays?
Well, I definitely get competitive during a race, but in training, for me, I'm most of the time. I'm a very intuitive trainer, meaning I've been doing it so long that I pretty much know what I got to do to get ready for something. I know I need to do speed work, and I know I need to keep all my strength training and my mobility, and I know I need to get in an X amount of miles about ballpark and so much climbing per week, and hit kind of those general numbers. I know I need to be in the ballpark, but I don't sweat it if I don't hit it exactly. I've learned over the years, especially, after almost 2 decades of racing and training for these dang things, that it really does, at the end of the day, like experience and consistency matters. And so, I've also learned from experience that sometimes you show up and you can't do that last sharpening bit at the end of the, last 3 weeks because, you got a calf that's acting up. And so, you gotta just kind of trust in your own experience that you're just going to show up on race day and like perform. And I think those are the kinds of things that only come with experience. So I do have an alter ego. I mean, Bronco's definitely an alter ego in a race. I definitely push him down the first half and he comes out the second half. I definitely visualize and, let him kind of take over. He likes I like to say he likes to slay young dragons. And we take out a sword and slice as we pass. Because I typically come from behind in hundreds, especially when there's a deep field. For example, in Western States last year, I think at mile 62, I was in 17th and I finished in 4th. So, I like to pass. I don't like to get passed. So I definitely take my time in the first half. I definitely race patiently in the first 50. And sometimes that can hurt you, if you don't take more risks early. But it also can play into being safe, too, and knowing that you're going to have a lot in the tank at the end.
Yeah, it always seems like to me when you get a race that's as competitive as Western States, or like from my experience, I've always seen this at like World 100Ks, is that if you kind of got to go in with a goal of like, I'm going to try to win this thing. And in that case, you kind of have to roll the dice a little bit at the beginning. But if you're like, all right, I'm just going to kind of run my race and, like be strong at the end, you can probably podium if you have a really good day doing that, but it's going to be hard to win because usually if you get like, say 10 guys all like run a little bit out of their comfort zone, sure, 8 or 9 of them blow up epically, but then one of them has the race of their life and that person's hard to catch that day.
Totally.
So like, and then it comes down to just kind of being realistic about where you think you can get to, and then plan accordingly. And I mean, that strategy's worked really well for you the last 2 years at Western States. Like, just imagining coming through Forest Hill in 17th place and then arriving in Auburn in 4th that's motivating when the mental side of the sport starts to really kick in and get difficult. When you're passing people like Jeff no doubtingly was that last 40 miles, that's what kind of gives you that little extra boost to kind of keep pushing when it's starting to get hard.
Yeah, and and you never know. I mean, there definitely was last year was questioning, like, what the heck, man? Like, I'm in 17th. Like this, I think the year before I was in maybe 8th coming out of Forest Hill, so at 62. Mm-hmm. So like, that's you're in the top 10. I felt good at that point, and I was like, sweet. In 17th, it was like, man, what the heck's going on today? No one's blowing up, or did I just go too slow? Like, what the heck? I don't feel like I went too slow. And then all of a sudden, everybody, starts coming back to you. And, I think I moved into top 10 by 78, and so right at the river. And then I started catching more guys on the way in. So it's like, it just really, every race is so different in how you have to race it, because sometimes there's only 2 guys that are fast in it, 2 other guys or 1 other guy. It only takes 1 guy to make it a race. Mm-hmm. But it just depends on, every race is totally different and how you approach those and in the conditions you have to deal with too. I mean, we're talking wild mountain races sometimes. So sometimes we have extreme heat, sometimes we have rain, sometimes we have, thunderstorms and lightning and at altitude, or river crossings, wildlife encounters. I definitely have had my fair share of wildlife encounters over the last, just because I don't use a pacer in 100. So I've definitely, had some close encounters with wildlife at night.
Yeah. And, like you said, with the weather variable too, like the caveat to what I said is if you get a year where it gets up to like 115 in the canyons, that's a year where like that strategy you put in place, that's when you could potentially win. And I think we do see that from time to time. I think probably the year Andrew Miller won that was 2016. I think he probably just ran a really smart race and then didn't have any like big hiccups, and that just resulted in him kind of outlasting a bunch of guys who maybe pushed a little too hard.
Yeah, he nailed that race. And if you look at like, last year, what's his name from South Africa?
Oh, Ryan Sands. Yeah.
Yeah, Ryan Sands. He ran super smart. Like he tried to go with Jim for a little bit, you know what I mean? Like kind of chase him, but realized like, man, it's hot today. Mm-hmm. And he's got enough experience and he's a veteran 100-mile runner. And he just said, you know what, that's not smart. And he laid back and he won.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting looking at him, like that shows his race intelligence too, because he's finished second at Western States in the past with like a low 15 hour, like 15:06, and then last year he wins with, what was it, 16:22. So he knew that like the course is harder this year, the weather might be worse than the last time. Play the course rather than a metric, and then it worked out well for him.
Yeah, totally.
Hey, I'm gonna put you guys on the spot. I want you guys to give me a 30-minute window of your time at Western States. What do you think, Jeff? What are you targeting? Assuming the weather's good. If it rains and there's wild deer running around chasing you, that's gonna change it. But
normal weather's hot, so I've been 16:30 there and 17. I think I was 17 something last year, 17:30. I think it was an hour slower because it was such a hot year and with all that snow in the high country. We don't have snow in the high country. I mean, I definitely like to better my time from 2002 sub 16:30 for sure. I mean, I'd love to get under 16 hours on that course, but I'd have to have like kind of one of those days, and the weather would have to cooperate a little bit too. Couldn't get crazy hot, but you typically get just used to you got to be ready. You got to expect crazy heat in that race.
Zach, what are you targeting, man?
Yeah, so kind of like
I think you said something like 14, 20, something like that. Was that right? Okay. What are you gonna come out with?
Yeah.
And then
if it's this is one of the reasons I'm really excited about this race is kind of like what Jeff was saying earlier. I've traditionally targeted more flatter races, and as far as mountain races go, Western States isn't necessarily like a super mountain or anything like that, but it's definitely got its ups and downs. So I'm going to be curious. Like, this is the first time in my life I've really had a real structured, focused training block on that type of terrain. So for me, it's going to be a little interesting in terms of like how my fitness has changed towards the trails and towards climbing and descending compared to in the past. So I think if the weather is normal, which is probably at least 100 in the canyons, I'll be targeting something in the 15 hours for sure. I think if I really nail it, I can get in the low 15s. But I'll definitely play to what the course provides and kind of where my body's at too. Like if we get out there and it's obvious it's a slow year, then I'm not going to start trying to hammer splits that would get me in a low 15 hour or anything like that.
No, when is it? When is the race, by the way? Because I'm not sure. I probably won't enter, so I haven't been paying attention.
I think it's June 23rd, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, June 23rd. Last
Well,
weekend in June.
I just followed Go Bronco Billy on Instagram, so I'll be looking for the updates and see how close you guys on your predictions there.
Yeah, we'll see, right?
If I go for that low 15 and blow up, I'll probably get kicked down by Bronco Billy, though.
I will slay you, young drag.
Oh, look at that. I like it. There you go.
If I sit on you, I'm guaranteed like somewhere in the top 5, I guess, right?
Yeah, it is like it's a tough race, man. I definitely, the one thing I would say is in hundreds is you got to run your own race and you can't run someone else's.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of drafting at that, or is there just not enough competitors for that to make a difference?
You can't draft on a trail unless you want to eat it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's drafting in the sense of someone pulling you along just because you're trying to match their pace, I guess, but not in terms of just trying to like create less wind resistance or anything like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's the sign of a inexperienced trail runner when they're right up on someone's back end.
Yeah, that's a good way to take a face plant.
Or roll.
All right, where I know, because I just found you on Instagram, so I got that Go Bronco Billy there. Where else can people find you at, Jeff?
Yeah, coaching services and all that athlete stuff's at gobroncobilly.com. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook's Go Bronco Billy, and that's the main places. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have. I mean, like I said, we're trying to get these people that are on the edges of human performance existence. I'm trying to get a hold of that competitive eater girl that eats 3 steaks in 20 minutes. Like she crushes like 200 ounces of steak. We'll see who else we can get on. It's been a pleasure from my part. Zach, anything else we didn't cover? Or
I think we did a good first round here, and thanks for coming on, Jeff. We'll be sure to put all your ways to contact you in the show notes as well, and maybe we can have you come back on after Western States, and we'll chat about how I beat you.
Yeah, we will. It was great to be on, guys. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
All right, cool, folks. That's episode 10 of the Human Performance Outliers Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, folks. Thanks again for tuning in to the Human Performance Outliers Podcast. Just a couple quick notes before you leave. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find us at HPOPodcast@gmail.com. That's HPOPodcast@gmail.com. We're both also on social media. On Twitter, you can find me at ZBitter. That's at ZBITTER. And you can find Shawn at SBakerMD. That's at SBAKERMD. We're both also on Instagram, where you can find me at ZachBitter. That's at ZACHBITTER. And for Shawn, it's at Shawn Baker 1967. That's at ShawnBaker 1967. Thanks again for tuning in to this episode of the Human Performance Outliers Podcast.